In 1979, the world watched as the Iranian Revolution brought in a new era for the Middle East. Few had a closer view of that transformation than Ambassador Bradley Gordon, who was on the CIA's Iran desk during the revolution. From sleeping at headquarters during one of the US's biggest national security crises to crafting the legislation that slowed Iran's nuclear program, Ambassador Gordon has spent decades on the front lines of US intelligence and policy. In this interview, he takes us behind the scenes. What did the US get wrong then, and are we making the same mistakes now? And how close is Iran really to building the bomb? Here's our full conversation with Ambassador Bradley Gordon. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador Gordon.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. So let's start, take us back to 1979. What was it like to be on the CIA Iran desk at the time of the revolution?
So, on the one hand, it was incredibly exciting. On the other hand, there were lots of nights that I was actually sleeping at the CIA. And because it was the most important national security issue that we had at the time, it was also fairly nervous-making because I was relatively new at the CIA, and here was a great chance to screw up.
Love it. How was Khomeini perceived early on by the CIA as well as externally?
So the CIA, you essentially mean me. How did I perceive him?
Then you, yes.
And I thought he was a huge menace. He had a huge following inside Iran, and he went after the Shah because he wanted to establish an Islamic Republic. And what was interesting about this was he was a senior Ayatollah, but had been living outside of Iran for a long time, first in Iraq and then in Paris. And he was having cassettes of his recordings pushed into Iran, and they became wildly popular. The Shah was not wildly popular. And he maintained his control through brutal force, through his what in today's in Iran would be Revolutionary Guard, was the Savak, his security forces. And his hope was to modernize Iran and to bring it into the 20th century. And he wasn't particularly willing to do this in a gradual way. He wanted to do it very quickly, and that caused a lot of consternation in the country. And when you shut down politics, when you shut down the possibility of political protest, what did Iranians do? They went to the mosque as their one place that the Shah wouldn't enter into. And that's why the mosque became the center of the political revolt that he faced.
Wow. And so that's what the Iranians were chasing. They did not want this sort of Western modernization. They wanted...
Some did, but Iran was still primarily a rural society. And even where it wasn't rural, Tehran had doubled in population from 4 million to 8 million in the period of a decade. And they didn't have the social services to accommodate that kind of population growth. And so a lot of people were poor, living in slums, and they migrated to the mosques.
Right. And so were there warning signs? You obviously saw that he was a menace, but were there warning signs that this regime would become so anti-Western?
So I have an interesting story. My predecessor on the Iran desk had been doing it for like 30 years. And he thought he'd seen everything. And he wrote in the summer of 1978, 5 months before the Shah fell, Iran is not now in a revolutionary nor even a pre-revolutionary situation. It goes to explain one of the reasons how I got the account, because he was taken off of it. So he just didn't see it coming. And that generally is the way these things happen. You don't see them coming until it's too late. That's how revolutions succeed. And when you do see it coming, you can put it down.
And so what signs did you see that your predecessor didn't?
Okay, so first of all, the size of the demonstrations started out relatively small and grew. And every time there was a demonstration and someone was killed, it ushered in a 40-day mourning period. And at the end of that 40-day mourning period, you knew there was going to be another demonstration, and it was larger. And what you essentially saw was people getting shot more frequently, which meant more demonstrations, which grew and grew and grew. And so the question was, could the Shah put it down? And regimes fall when their when their mechanism to create force and stop what's going on fails. And what happened was the people who were putting down the revolt, Savak, essentially stopped shooting on their own people. And when you stop shooting on your own people, regimes fall. And that's what happened. They are hard to predict, but nevertheless, this one looked to me like it was going down. Remember that President Carter had been there earlier and said that Iran is an island of stability in a sea of instability. Yeah, so he got it wrong too.
So what things were the West misreading that we may be, and do you see any parallels with how we're misreading Iran today?
So what we misread was the power of the mosque movement, the power of Khomeini having all of these cassettes and having them heard over and over and over again in the mosques. And you had a social setting in which people couldn't live. There were people who were just so not being taken care of by society. You had rural population. The majority of the population was rural. They were traditional and they were religious. All of that combined into one huge mess. And so the demonstrations grew not only in Tehran, but around the country. And they became too large to handle. And that's when regimes fall.
Right.
Plus, there was one other factor in all of this. There were two other factors. One, we were telling the Shah, don't crack down. And he was a very sick man and under a lot of medication. So you put all of that together, you get a revolution.
Right. So do you think where Iran is today, it's past, do you think the motivating factor is religion, power, ideology, or something else? What do you think that
So
factor is?
right now, the regime maintains power through brute force. There are 90 million people living in Iran. About 80% of them can't stand this regime. But when you have 90 million people, 20% is still a lot of people. And they control all of the weapons. The people of Iran would love to get rid of this. It's a corrupt regime, and people are forced to live in ways in which they don't want to live. And the regime would fall were it not for the Revolutionary Guard, the military. The Revolutionary Guard has its own group of thugs that they maintain power through. So what you have to begin to look for if you're going to actually see some kind of real regime threatening development, and you could have seen it, you saw it in 2022 when there were these mass movements over the death of some students. And people were demonstrating all over the place, and they just jailed all the leadership, and it fell apart. So right now, I don't see that yet. But clearly the regime is weaker now than it has been. It's lost its major allies in the region. The loss of Assad in Syria was huge. Hezbollah has been enormously weakened and aren't really much of a force in Lebanon anymore. Hamas is not much more of a threat. And who does that leave? The Houthis? They are in deep trouble. And I am sure that they are very nervous about their current situation.
Right. So if this regime is to fall and all of these proxies that you mentioned also fall, what do you think will happen to the region?
See, they have so cauterized the political leadership in Iran. There is no obvious group of people to take over. You have the son of the Shah, who has some support in Iran. But beyond him, there aren't people of real stature. Would somebody emerge out of the military? I don't know. Israel has done a reasonably good job of decapitating a lot of people who could have been potential leaders who would not want to change the nature of the regime. And Khamenei is an old, sick man. And so he, when I worked on Iran at the CIA, I would see periodically these intel reports that Khomeini was next to death. And he lived until 1989. So, we'll see. But right now, the fact that you don't see any cracks in their security forces means they're likely to hold on to power for a while.
Right. You don't see the regime falling anytime soon,
I
even
don't
with.
see it falling anytime soon. I am deathly afraid to say that because now I'm saying exactly what the guy who had the job before me said.
Right. What do you miss? Right. Right. No, look, that's your professional opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, moving into this more recent conflict, what was your reaction to this reveal of Iran of Israel having these covert operations within Iran and this most recent
So if you
back
would
and
have
forth?
asked me that question before this all started, I would have pointed out to you maybe the most incredible intelligence feat I have ever seen was when Israel knew where Iran had stashed all of its nuclear papers in a beaten down warehouse in South Tehran, knew where it was, got into Iran, got into that warehouse, took out millions of pieces of paper, and got out of the country without getting caught. That I've never seen. This is better from an intelligence perspective. The fact that they were able to smuggle in so much into Iran, the fact that they knew where 9 leading nuclear scientists were, the fact that they knew where generals were, the fact that they were able to precisely target things was truly astonishing.
And so what kind of covert activity leads to us to Israel getting this information?
So, as it happens, there are tens of thousands of Israelis who speak perfectly native Persian because they are Persian. They're Persian Jews who made Aliyah to Israel. And I am sure that it is from amongst that population that Israeli intelligence has gotten a lot of people in there. And so they were able to actually have that kind of effect. But the precision with which they are targeting, they have done a lot of damage to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. There is this concept of mowing the lawn, which is to say, when the grass gets too high, you mow it. And so Israel saw the Iranian nuclear program, which we will talk about, I'm sure. They saw it as getting too close. And so they mowed the lawn. They mowed the lawn because by themselves, they don't have the capability to destroy it entirely. They don't have the ability through bunker buster bombs to get primarily at Fordo, which is the one that's built into a mountain way beneath the surface of the earth. But we do. And that, of course, is what President of the United States is mulling over now.
So you spoke about this idea of mowing the lawn. That every few years they get a little bit close. You get those nuclear scientists, you get these sites, whatever. And there's criticism from the public saying that Iran wasn't close to a nuclear weapon, that this was just Israel wanting to be a warmonger.
Utter nonsense. Utter
Tell
nonsense.
us why.
So, first, To run a nuclear power reactor, you need enriched uranium at 3.7% enriched. There is no reason, if all you want to do is have civilian nuclear power, to go to enrich beyond that. By the way, there's no reason for you to have an enrichment capability. Iran is the only non-nuclear country that actually maintains an internal enrichment capability. Everybody else that has nuclear power that don't have nuclear weapons, it's a lot cheaper to go buy the 3.7% enriched uranium, run it through your reactors, and then get rid of it. Put it in a pool outside and let it soak for a while, and then you get rid of it. It's a lot cheaper. So why does Iran want to have their own internal enrichment? Why did Iran want a nuclear weapon to begin with? They wanted it to begin with because they thought Saddam Hussein was trying to get one. And that spurred them on in the early 1980s. Think about this for a minute. We started in 1940 to develop an atomic bomb at a time in which no one had ever done it before. We had to figure out how to do it. We had to invent all of the technology, and we had a bomb in 5 years. Iran has been after this since the mid-1980s, and they still don't have a bomb. And part of the reason for that is that you can't go into Walmart and buy centrifuges. And so you have to develop all of this internally on your own. And it takes a very long time. And the part of what I was involved in was to come up with ways to go after both their demand and supply side to get a nuclear weapon. Their demand side, whether they could afford it or not. And that's why over a period of several years, sanctions were imposed on the one thing they have besides carpets and pistachios, and that's oil. And essentially we said, anybody who helps Iran develop its own oil infrastructure won't be able to do business in the United States, or at least be threatened with not being able to do business in the United States. So if you're Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company, and the possibility of investing in the Iranian oil sector could lose you all of your gas stations in the United States, when you've got plenty of other places to invest your money in to develop oil infrastructure, why on earth would you do it? When the Shah left power, Iran was producing 6 million barrels of oil a day. By 1996, the most they could produce on a good day was 3 million barrels. In part because they didn't try to develop their fields. And once they tried to, they faced sanctions. So all of which is to say that this regime now, still under grievous sanctions, faces a similar situation. They have one thing to sell, that's oil. And it is difficult to do. It is difficult to do it now. And their economy is deeply suffering as a result.
Right, because these sanctions and legislation and Israel's actions have kept them from getting further.
Exactly.
So even though
Exactly.
there's been this warning of Iran's getting close to a nuclear weapon, every single time that they've gotten close, the US,
Right. So
Israel, or someone has done something to take care of
let
it.
me talk about that for a moment. How
Yeah, yeah,
close
please.
are they? So when you are at 60% enriched uranium, you are a hop, skip, and a jump away from 90% enriched. It's not an arithmetic progression when you are enriching uranium. The higher level of purification, the quicker it goes. Second, when you enrich uranium, it's a gas, uranium hexachloride, and it's got to be changed into a metal. Can they do that? One of the things that the IAEA just reported on was they've discovered a facility in Iran to do exactly that, in Isfahan, to take enriched uranium gas and convert it into a metal. Then you've got to be able to make it into a hemisphere, put it into a missile, and then you have to have what's called a neutron initiator, where you bombard the bomb with neutrons, and every time a neutron hits a enriched uranium atom, it lets out 2 neutrons. Those 2 neutrons hit 2 enriched uranium atoms, and you've got 4 neutrons. If you have a machine doing that to the entire bomb, very quickly you have a nuclear chain reaction. Can they do that? There are indications that they are getting close to doing that. So the notion that Khomeini hasn't given an order to go develop a nuclear weapon is absurd. Why have this kind of cadre of nuclear scientists? Why have this incredible nuclear infrastructure? Why enrich to 60%? The whole point of all of this is to have a nuclear weapon, because they believe if they have a nuclear weapon, nobody will threaten them. And they may very well be right about that. Not only that, but having a nuclear weapons capability greatly expands their influence in the region.
Right.
So there are all kinds of reasons that Khamenei doesn't have to say, go build me a bomb.
That there's already all these things in the works.
Right, they're doing it.
They're doing it, right? It's very clear. The intention is very clear. So what do you say to people in the West who are against this war?
So there's a lot to be said about this. First, is their own view of Prime Minister Netanyahu. They don't like what he's done in Gaza. They believe he's doing it only for his own political purposes. He's cried wolf on Iran, from their perspective, cried wolf on Iran for a very long period of time. He's doing this again, simply as a way of prolonging his own ability to stay in office. All of which may or may not be true, but it has little to do with the real understanding that Iran was getting very close to a nuclear weapons capability. And the one thing that Israel cannot abide by is having Iran with a nuclear weapon. And so you can go after him for all kinds of motivations. But on this one, I don't think he had a choice.
Right, right. So thank you. Yes. And just still on this topic of nuclear expansion, you were talking about in 1995 you worked on a few pieces of legislation to
Yes.
to keep Iran's nuclear program at bay.
Yes.
Please, yeah, speak about that and tell us
Sure.
how those were successful pieces of legislation.
Sure. I won't go through every piece, but the first piece was to go after investment in Iran's oil infrastructure, which they had done nothing to for 15 years, and were desperate to actually get investment in it. And so Congress passed a law that sought to threaten the possibility of sanctions against anybody investing in the Iranian energy sector. And it laid out a series of possible sanctions, one of which was a slap on the wrist. And then it got increasingly worse until finally one sanction threatened the ability to invoke IEPA, the very thing that President Trump is now invoking, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, that allows you to impose an embargo on companies. You can say you aren't doing business in the United States. And the fact that that was one of the possibilities in this piece of legislation greatly discouraged companies from doing it. So that was to go after the demand side, the ability to actually afford this. And then we went after the supply side, which is to say, they've got to get this equipment from somebody. They got the ability to build first-generation centrifuges from the Pakistanis, who got it from the Chinese. And centrifuges are these long cylindrical things that spin around very fast. Uranium, natural occurring uranium, is 99% inert. Less than 1% of it is fissionable. And when you have these long chains of centrifuges that spin around very fast, the centrifugal force of the centrifuges allows you to separate the two and allows you to build up the amount of enriched uranium. But you actually have to have the centrifuges to do it. And so they went after that. They had a huge marketing effort throughout Europe and Asia to get the kinds of equipments that you need. And so what the United States did through legislation enacted by Congress was to go to those countries, to go to those suppliers and say, we're going to put you out of business. You're going to go to jail. Unless you are prepared to start sending into Iran faulty merchandise. And so Iran was buying this stuff that wouldn't work. That slowed them down. And so there was a combination of all of these factors about nobody willing to actually invest. Their banking system is still incredibly corrupt. You don't know who you're doing business with. They finance terror. And if you're going to do a real investment in Iran, it's very hard to do that without using banks. And so the possibility of sanctioning banks became a huge disincentive. So all of those prolonged how long it took them to get to be able to develop all of this and to afford it. And that's why it's been 40 years and they still don't have it. They are dangerously close now, however.
Right, right. I really appreciate those details, and I think those are very important because I think oftentimes the West receives news from the Middle East on a very surface level, right, left, very simple way, and I think it's so
Right.
much more complex than that. And so all of this effort that Iran is going to get this nuclear weapon, their end goal is, what do you believe their end goal is to have this nuclear weapon for? I know we sort of touched on it, but what do you think it is?
Okay. So, in the first instance, it's to have the weapon because that greatly expands its ability to act in the region and to have allies in the region. It's one of the reasons that the Abraham Accords worked, because all of those Arab states in the Gulf are deathly afraid of Iran getting that, even now before they have it, and believe that it will be only Israel that will actually dare do something against Iran. So, so they want it because it gives them huge leverage in the region. They want it because they think that it preserves their country. Nobody will dare go after them if they could threaten that the attackers with an atomic bomb, with a nuclear weapon. They want it because they believe that it enhances their own international status. They see themselves as a great country, and having a nuclear weapon gives them great nation status. So there's some ego involved. There's some real thought about how you protect the country, how you make sure that the country continues to have the influence in the region that it has, and because Israel has one. Israel has the nuclear capability.
But what's the motivation to have the capacity for nine, as the IAEA reported?
It's 9 now.
Right.
I mean, why
Okay.
not just one?
Why not, right. That's my question. Why not just one?
Because everybody would know it. The fact that they now have the capacity for 9, and if they aren't stopped, they'll have the capacity for 30 and 40 and 60. It makes them into a major nuclear power. And
And
that
so it's
simply enhances all of the things that I mentioned before.
right. And so in your opinion, Israel felt Iran was getting a little too close, and there was no other option.
Yes, that's my opinion, and I think it's um, hard to argue with. They have the increasing enriched uranium. They're very close to getting it to 90%. We now know they have some of the mechanisms necessary to weaponize it, to actually go for a weapon. And the parts that we don't know whether they have at this point, I'm willing to not wait to find out whether they
Right.
have them or not, because I think they probably do. And so I think um, Israel had no choice but to act now. And I'm sure they would hope that President Trump drops the bunker busters on Fordo and knocks it out. The only other way to do that is for an Israeli operation of boots on the ground on a Revolutionary Guard base.
Right.
That would not be an easy mission. So, which gets us back to mow the lawn.
Right. So you've said how you think maybe this will pan out, but what would be the ideal situation? Maybe we can close with this. What you think, how the way that this should go, or the where what would be the ideal situation that how this should end?
The ideal situation is regime change in Iran.
Right.
Um,
You don't see that happening anytime soon.
I don't know. It's very hard to predict regime change.
Right, right.
But I think that internally they are weaker now than they have been, ever been. Um, it may not be weak enough, but they are weaker now than they've ever been. Um, and it's only with regime change that I think you can actually get to an Iran that most Iranians want, which is a peaceful, stable, um, and in many ways powerful country. It is a very sophisticated country with a great educational and talented base of people. And they are being not allowed to see their own potential because of the regime they have.
Absolutely. Yes, well, we hope for peace and safety and democracy for the people of Iran and safety for the people of Israel and the US as well.
Right, right.
But thank you so much. This is so interesting. I know that our audience will find this super, super fascinating. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Sure, glad to do it.